It was all going so well. We left Moses last week at a real high. As we read in the end of chapter 4, it says, Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and they worshipped. I would imagine that Moses was feeling pretty confident. He was on a high. It was going to be okay. God was going to deliver them. Excited, expectant, eager, he heads off to Pharaoh. And we pick that up straight away in the start of chapter 5. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so they may hold a festival to me in the desert." Confidence, and he was feeling good. And then we read this. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Oh. What happened? That wasn't on Moses' script. That wasn't what was meant to happen. And as we read through chapter 5, it goes from bad to worse. As after Pharaoh has rejected Moses and Aaron's appeal, Pharaoh says, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous and you are stopping them from working." That same day, Pharaoh gave his orders to the slave drivers and foremen in charge of the people. "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. This is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Make them work harder for the men so that they can keep working and pay no attention to lies." And it's not just Pharaoh that starts to turn on Moses. We read later on that the foremen, the Israelites who were put in charge of the workers, as they realized they were in trouble, and they go and speak to Pharaoh. But as they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, "May the Lord look upon you and judge you. You have made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." And as we read in chapter 6 in verse 9, it's not just the foreman, it is all the people, including those elders who were right there behind them. As when Moses reported the news to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and their cruel bondage. What a really bad day for Moses. We started at that high at the beginning of the chapter, and we end chapter 5 with Moses back before God, asking the question we find ourselves so often asking: why, God? Why? It was obvious. I go to Pharaoh, you deliver, job done. Why did this happen? We read it in chapter 5, verse 22. Moses returned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon his people, and you have not rescued your people at all." We find ourselves, don't we, in so many situations and so many times asking that question, why, God? This seemed to be the thing I thought you were going to do. Why has this happened? It's a question, actually, I'm not going to answer. Because it's a question we'll find as we look through the Bible, and when so many people ask God that question, he doesn't actually answer them. You have that amazing book of Job where he is asking all these questions, and how does God respond? Who are you? Do you put the storehouses of snow? Do you control the animals and the clouds and the weather? And he turns it back to to Job with a question. Sometimes Some of those why questions, when we have the ability to look back in hindsight, we can see actually got the reason why God was holding something back or was delaying because maybe we weren't ready. And I think we'll find as we look at this, Moses wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to lead the people fully. He wasn't ready to trust God completely. Interestingly, yes, he goes to Pharaoh with the words God has said, but he doesn't go in the way God told him to. He doesn't trust him or follow him completely. Israel weren't ready to follow Moses and to put their lives in his hands as he led them out of Egypt. And Pharaoh certainly wasn't ready to let the people go. Sometimes it's only really in heaven that we will find the question why. Earlier this week I asked a question on Facebook, as I sometimes do when I'm preparing to preach, and I just asked the question, how do you trust God through really difficult circumstances and situations? And Christine wrote a beautiful reply, and thank you for those that did reply, such openness and honesty. But Christine wrote, one day in heaven I hope to have better answers. But I think by then I will have forgotten I even had a question. You see, the why question is a good one to ask, but it's not one that we really should be expecting an answer to. And just a little aside, can I encourage us as church not to answer the why question when someone else asks it? Often what we'll do is we'll answer it with some unbiblical half-truths. Phrases like, well, everything happens for a purpose, actually isn't in the Bible and isn't necessarily true. So be careful that we don't answer those questions when people ask them. But it is good to ask these questions. So what do you do when everything seems to be falling apart? How do you respond when you are asking this question, why God, why is this happening? And I just want us this morning just to look briefly at the situation Moses is in and see what we can learn from that. It doesn't answer every single person's situation, but I hope there will be some general lessons we can apply. And 4 really simple points I see in this passage. Number 1 is turn to God. Thankfully, Moses didn't do what he did last time he mucked up. Last time he mucked up, he ran, he fled, he hid from God. This time, he turns to God. And you know, when you're at the lowest, when you're full of questions, when you're in the midst of that storm, the best person to turn to is God. When you feel as low as anything, turn to God, because he is the one that will lift you up. He is the one that will give you the strength to keep going. He is the one that will provide all that you need. And we do need to turn to him. Second thought from here is that we need to listen to God. God never said to Moses, you'll go to Pharaoh, and when you ask him to let the people go, he will say, off you go. He did in some respects. God said, yes, he will deliver them, but he added some extra bits, or there was a journey to that. In chapter 3, verse 19, God said to Moses, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. In chapter 4, verse 21, God says, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. See, Moses is baffled by what God doesn't do, but this flows from his misunderstanding of what God had promised to do. And many times we'll find when we're asking that question, why, it will be because we have a misunderstanding of what God has promised us. Has God promised it will all be okay? Has God promised that he'll make our lives pain-free and easy? Well, Jesus promised life in all its fullness, not life in all of its easiness. And like Moses, we'll often overlook the difficult, hard passages where God does say about how life will be. In Philippians 1, verse 29, For it's been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. God doesn't promise us an easy life. He doesn't promise us a trouble-free life. And so when troubles come, maybe God isn't the person to turn to and ask why, in the sense of, why is this happening? I thought it was going to be easy or straightforward. But he's the person to turn to and ask help. So we need to turn to God. We need to listen to God and truly hear his promises to us. And then number 3, we need to recognize God. You see, Moses was still trying to do things in his strength. He was still trying to be the one that delivered the people and not fully trust God. We need to realize we are not God. We do not see things as he does. We do not know what is always best for us. We do not see the bigger picture or the bigger plan as God sees it. And in reply to Moses' question, why, God doesn't answer him or console him or comfort him. But God reminds Moses who he is. In chapter 6, you'll find 5 times God says, I am the Lord. He declares who he is, who God is. And he also says what he will do. In fact, the chapter starts, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. And 7 times God outlines, I will do this, I will bring this, I will deliver, I will redeem, I will give. And then following on from chapter 6, there are 6 chapters of God just displaying his greatness as the 10 plagues are outplayed across Egypt. And we see chapter after chapter after chapter of God declaring that he is the Lord God, the one over all. You see, when Moses was at his lowest, God reminded Moses who he was, who God was. Charles Swindoll, who's written a great book on Moses, and many of us are using this in our preaching, says the following: so often the arrow that penetrates the believer at the weakest point is our unbelief. We know in our hearts what God has said and who he is, but it takes faith to put it into gear. You see, we need at these points to know who God is, to be reminded who he is, but then we need to act on it. And there's my 4th and final point. We need to obey God. We'll see, if you carried on reading, you will see Moses starts to obey God. He starts to follow him word for word. As if God says, he does. And as we see that moving forward, we see God displaying who he is. Sometimes we need to obey God through small steps. Sometimes it might be huge leaps. But often when we're at the lowest, it's just those small little steps. We need to just remind ourselves, maybe on a daily basis, that God is good, and find something every day to give him thanks. We need to remind ourselves that God welcomes me, and we need to turn to him every day. We need to remind ourselves that God is faithful. Remind ourselves on a daily basis of the promises he speaks over us. And we need to remind ourselves that God is there in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the difficult time. God is there. He may be silent. He may be still, but he is there. He is with you and me in those difficult times, in those times when we are crying out, why, when we have questions. God is there. Back to the Facebook post I put, Andrea wrote the following: it may sound glib, but looking for small signs or things to thank God helped me trust that he was still there and he still loved me. Maybe you need today to take those small steps to move forward from where you are today and take the small steps as you trust and obey God, as you recognize him, and then you obey what he's asking you to do. You see, in this part of the story, Moses begins to obey God. And at the right time, in his time, God brings that deliverance to the people, as we will hear next week. And I think at that time, Pharaoh was ready to let them go. He was ready to let the people go. The people, the Israelites, were ready to follow and to trust Moses, to the extent where they just got up and went and followed him. And Moses was ready to trust and fully obey God. Even at that point, as we'll hear in a few weeks' time, when he was caught with the Red Sea in front of him and an advancing Egyptian army behind him, he trusted God and raised his staff up when all looked impossible. But he stepped out and trusted God. It's okay to ask the question why. You may not get an answer. You're very unlikely to get an answer from God. But it's okay to ask that question, because that means you are coming to God and saying, God, why? And as we come to him, we need to listen and hear what he does say, what he has promised over us, and what he is saying in that moment. And we need to recognize that he is God. He is above our thoughts. He is way above who we are. But that he loves us and steps down to be with us in the midst of that storm. And we need to trust and obey him as he leads us and as he brings us forward out of that situation. And so I pray this morning that in the midst of where you are, you will know God with you. You will know his presence with you. You will know his protection around you. You will know his guidance leading you forward. And you will know his Spirit bringing you strength and hope today.